On the front line, they not only provide mobility, but formidable firepower. The battle group is here in the hope of helping to implement peace and ultimately to get the refugees back into their homes.
The majority, well, most of them are actually looking forward to actually getting up there and doing everything. I mean, we've done a lot of training for the situation, so obviously people want to go up there and do what we've been trained to do.
You know, everyone's really geared up to get something done. However, whether that be a peacekeeping or in whatever way it might happen, everyone's eager to get on with it, get the job done, and just basically try and do the best job we can.
At present, 3 infantry battalions are in training in the UK, on standby to join the British contingent in the Balkans. If they're sent, they'll join the 5,500 British troops already here. David Crabtree, Sky News, Krivolak, Macedonia.
The peace, they would be going forward, and they perhaps would have found some opposition, and then are going forward to neutralise this. This is part of their work-up to create the right working and war-fighting capability within the battle group, so they can then go forward to the border and join the rest of the 4th Armoured Brigade. And I have to tell you, the morale here is excellent, that everyone is in top form. And there's a feeling that they're ready to go, so therefore they're starting to get a bit of frustration. But as you can hear behind me, the 30mm guns are going. There's quite a lot of contact. These are live shells they're using. This is a live firing range. This is the fun and exercise, ready to move forward.
Perfect about its effectiveness. The American news magazine Newsweek has reported that the Pentagon has warned that air power on its own is unlikely to be successful. A similar message has come from the general who masterminded the Gulf War campaign.
The difficulty we're having right now is the political rhetoric is not matched by the political objective, and the political objective is not matched by the means that are being applied to that objective. So in this instance, we have decided to use a single form of military power, air power. It may work. I mean, the Serbians are taking one terrible beating, but so are the Kosovars.
But so far, Washington has not even authorized the use of its Apache attack helicopters. They've been in the region for weeks and are now said to be fully ready.
Hello, Frank. Yes, I'm at the Krivolak training area, which is right in the center of Macedonia. It's actually the Macedonian Army's own training area. It's been taken over at the moment by the Irish Guards Battle Group, and that's a unit which is composed not just of Irish Guards. It's got Green Howards here, Household Cavalry Regiment, the King's Royal Hussars, the Royal Engineers, the Signals, the electrical and mechanical engineers, just about everything in the army that you need in order to put a small group of 900 men and all their equipment into battle is here. And we've been this morning watching them doing what they call company drills. They've been doing advance to contact. That's where they take their warrior vehicles. You might be able to see some of them behind me. They take them out and they're testing their guns. So we've had a very good indication of just how good at the moment, how professionally well trained the Irish Guards are.
They've been Yugoslav soldiers that NATO is trying to bomb. We were told that these men were preparing to withdraw, though this could not be verified. Later, on the edge of a forest, we met the commander of Yugoslav forces in Kosovo, General Vladimir Lazarevic. He told me that his men are in control of the situation and denied that they are guilty of war crimes.
You don't understand the Serbian soldier. If he has a fault, it's that he forgives his enemy. All the crimes are being committed by NATO.
Albanian villagers and border police fire wildly across a mountain ridge. They say Serb forces have taken over a small village inside Albania, a claim supported by international observers.
Serbs, they took a piece of our land.
Skirmishes like this one last week appear to be escalating along the northeastern border with Yugoslavia.
Yugoslav forces are in our territory about 400 meters. They made positions there and are shooting in our villages and at our police.
Until now, villagers say they fought their own battles, defending their homes without the help of the Albanian army.
Albanian forces, they are not involved. They have lots of reasons. We don't know the reasons, but just the border police are coming here.
But this time, the Albanian army joined the fray from a distance. Albanian tanks fired at the Serbs over the heads of villagers and police.
Called for a force of 28,000, and U.S. officials say much of the increase is due to engineering units which will have to repair the damage done to Kosovo by Serb ethnic cleansing and NATO bombing. This is not an invasion.
Supporters of the NATO action now have an ominous outlook.
I think the big danger at this stage is that the NATO alliance will fall apart. This is something that Milosevic is very good in exploiting because he knows that the time might be with him and not with NATO, as NATO assumed.
Guards training in Macedonia. They're preparing to spearhead a NATO force into Kosovo. All they're waiting for is the political decision to go in.
And we just want to go in there and do our job for the refugees, getting them back.
We've been training constantly for the past year now. We're ready to do pretty much anything.
But a senior Yugoslav army general has warned NATO troops entering Kosovo can expect hell on earth.
Firing live rounds, but not in anger, not yet in any case. British troops, members of the Irish Guards, shooting at targets in the Warrior armoured personnel carriers. Warriors are capable of carrying 9 soldiers at speeds of up to 80 kilometers into the enemy territory, while firing machine gun rounds and a 30mm cannon. They're made for opening the way for the infantry to move into a hostile environment in relative safety. The terrain and the climate are almost exactly like those in Kosovo. Irish Guards are part of the 5,600 British troops in Macedonia. British are the biggest contingent of nearly 14,000 NATO troops here, part of an original plan to enforce a peace that has not yet materialized. Today, their role is little less certain.
These soldiers say they're practicing for peacekeeping operations, but they also know that they could soon be asked to fight it out into Kosovo. If it comes to that, these vehicles could be on the front line.
Most of the soldiers don't think it will come to a ground war, even though they know it's a possibility.
It's a good terrain to work in. It gives us a good basis on what we can expect even when we do get into Kosovo, whether it be a fighting force or a peacekeeping force.
Analysts say up to 200,000 troops may be needed if the NATO alliance finally decides to send in the troops. Then, for these soldiers, this training could well prove a lifesaver.
They know that should they have to go and do a job that may risk their lives, they are trained and they will minimize those risks.
For the moment, though, a lot of practicing and a lot of waiting. Hasranajis, CNN, Krivolaj.
There's this great sort of furore that for some reason Britain is wanting to send in ground troops and nobody else is. If you actually look at the detail of what has been discussed over the last couple of days, you will see that actually what has happened is that NATO have looked at what they are going to need when they go into Kosovo to sort the place out. The original figure is 28,000 troops. We're now on 50,000 troops. That's not because 50,000 troops are needed to invade Kosovo. It's because the amount of damage that has been done, the situation on the ground is so serious that they're going to need more troops. They're going to have to police it, clear mines, build roads and build houses to put people back into. But if you look at the message coming out of Washington at the moment, it is very much no ground troops until we have actually got an agreement. That agreement must be achieved.
A whistle-stop tour, but one clearly considered vital by the Prime Minister. NATO military provided his escort. Albania is now a country with a huge army, albeit not their own. It's also a country with a huge refugee problem. Not refugees certainly, but troops important to his overall strategy as well. Touring the A4 HQ, it was a chance to boost morale and speak to the troops, soldiers who may yet find themselves fighting a ground war in Yugoslavia.
Well, I don't think we
There is to be no pause and no let-up in the air campaign could not be clearer, with the announcement that 90 more warplanes are to be deployed by the end of the month.
10s have just been dispatched to Italy. They are now able to fly low because after 8 weeks of bombing, much of Yugoslavia's air defenses have been knocked out.
I'll guarantee you the A-10 is flying at an altitude that is appropriate for that aircraft to be very, very effective.
So effective, Pentagon officials say it makes little sense to send in the low-flying Apaches, which are vulnerable to shoulder-fired missiles. The Pentagon denies, though, that it blocked the use of the Apaches out of fear of casualties. But sources say NATO Commander General Wes Clark may have been discouraged from asking for final permission to use the Apaches, well aware of the Pentagon's reservation.
Into Kosovo.
Serbia.
Below us, the town of Jakovica, many of whose citizens are said to have been slaughtered by the Serbs. It is a place of terrifying stillness and silence, where nothing moves on the roads, where no one works in the fields, where Serbian soldiers were the only human beings we could see.
Forces in Macedonia are battle-ready and frustrated that NATO was not ready to order them into Kosovo. Their commander knows that deploying ground troops is the only way to make sure that the refugees return home before winter.
The sense of urgency, absolutely. But, you know, whether it's this week or next month or whatever, we just need to bring the conflict to a successful and rapid resolution.
Activity this week, Britain's voice is a lonely one in pressing NATO to send in troops without a peace agreement. Tony Blair's not just talking. He's put 3,200...
Opposition to sending ground troops to Kosovo before Yugoslav President Milosevic agrees. No change, despite growing pressure both at home and abroad. The government of British Prime Minister Tony Blair wants to avoid giving Milosevic a veto. He argues it may soon be time to prepare a force to take advantage of damage done by NATO's air campaign.
If Albanian tanks and missile launchers moved closer to the border this week. A message to Yugoslavia: don't send troops into our territory.
They shell our villages, we will wait. But when they cross the border, we respond with our forces until they go back.
Until now, the Albanian army let villagers and police fight the border skirmishes. The Albanians say while they want NATO to deal with the problem in Yugoslavia, Albania will protect its own interests. Headlines in Tirana, Albania's capital, scream, tanks in Morena ready to fight.
First significant decline in the public support for the air war against the Milosevic regime in Yugoslavia. The percentage of Americans backing the bombing campaign has dropped from 65% to 59% in the past 3 weeks. And the number of people here who believe the Allies are not being careful enough is up from 19% to 32%.
That means NATO involvement, but to make it acceptable to the Serbs, that also means possible United Nations and Russian involvement. After that, then find a way for the Yugoslav military to withdraw from Kosovo and the bombing to stop.
With a picture of an international force gathering along the borders of Kosovo, capable and ready to overwhelm its Serb opponents if ever the order is given. But the order hasn't been given, and while Britain and America have repeated daily the claim that NATO is united and determined to force the Serbs out of Kosovo, the commitment of some European NATO nations to a continuing military sledgehammer is dissolving. Italian troops have been manoeuvring in preparation for battle, while their government has been saying that there is no political premise for NATO troops to enter Kosovo. And several of the Italian coalition parties have voiced serious doubts about even continuing the bombing.
Today broadcasting pictures of its troops dug in along Kosovo's border with Albania. The message was unmistakable, that NATO forces will have to fight their way into Serbia, engaging the Yugoslav army every inch of the way. So even as British troops in Macedonia train for combat, the idea of a full-scale land invasion after an inconclusive air war has left many of NATO governments shuddering at the risks and consequences of fighting the Serbs.
And although they may be short of armour, they may be short of artillery, certainly well-armed troops dug into the hillsides with shoulder-control weapons, wide-guarded missiles, could do an awful lot of damage to NATO ground forces coming through these narrow defiles and ravines.
That's why, even after 2 months, the hope remains that air power alone will do the job, and that NATO soldiers only go in to enforce a political settlement.
Escorted by Kosovo Liberation Army fighters, we walked into Kosovo, and the sound of war was all around us. They took us to a frontline base recently captured from the Serbs. The fighting is taking place in the hills close by, and the KLA is desperate to defend the small amount of territory it's gained. The unit commander claimed 3 Serbs had been killed in the last 24 hours. He had taken us inside Kosovo to show us their successes. This was a Serb headquarters, he said, captured and destroyed by his men. They want to refute Serb claims that they've been defeated. Yes. But these are not new battlefield victories, and the biggest problem for the KLA is that they lack the heavy weapons to make real progress against the formidable Yugoslav army.
These KLA fighters are claiming success in at least 3 attacks against Serb forces in the past 48 hours. But the truth is they will make little headway against a powerful army without continued and heavy NATO bombing.
Why is your weapon shooting bloody seagulls?
On a hillside just a few miles from the fighting, we found the KLA's raw recruits being trained by a British volunteer. A former soldier in the British Army, John Harrison, claims he's unpaid, that he's here for the cause, not for the money, but says only NATO ground troops can win the battle for Kosovo.
Over!
We've got no tanks. We've got no heavy artillery. The only things we've got is what we can carry in our arms.
Many of these young fighters will be killed in this war, but that is a sacrifice many are prepared to make.
NATO plans a bigger and more heavily armed ground presence than originally foreseen, but an invasion of Kosovo while Yugoslav troops are still dug in is out of the question, says NATO, for the time being. The British refuse to rule out the possibility. The Germans currently oppose the idea.
1,000 bombs, and U.S. officials say they are picking up intelligence that some Serb army units in Kosovo have had enough.
As many as 500 Serbian army soldiers appear to have deserted their deployment locations in Kosovo yesterday to return to their homes in Serbia.
And the Pentagon says airstrikes have destroyed 90% of Serb artillery in Kosovo.
We've also made significant progress against the APCs and the tanks, taking out probably about 1/3 or more of the total armored vehicles, as well as many other vehicles such as trucks.
But it's too late to stop the massacre of civilians. The State Department already has released a reconnaissance photo of a mass burial site. Today it released a videotape of what that same burial site looked like from the ground. Airstrikes alone cannot stop the killing. Only ground troops can do that. Serbs guarding the invasion routes into Kosovo can see American helicopters just across the border in Albania, but the U.S. insists it will not send in troops until there is a peace agreement. British officials want to go in as soon as the Serb army is no longer able to mount an organized resistance.
The British call that a semi-permissive environment.
Explosions and bright orange flashes clearly heard and seen from central Belgrade. Eyewitnesses also reported seeing at least 2 surface-to-air missiles fired during the attack. Belgrade television stations say NATO struck a chemical plant as well as fuel storage tanks some 15 miles southeast of Belgrade. Eyewitnesses also say that an area of Dedinje, an affluent suburb of Belgrade, was also hit, and that emergency services, including firefighters and ambulances, are now in attendance. The latest NATO raid, although relatively short in duration, appears to have been the heaviest since the Chinese embassy here was hit nearly 2 weeks ago. It came as upbeat reports emerged from the official Yugoslav media that after some 7 hours of talks between Mr. Chernomyrdin and President Milosevic, that broad agreement had been reached on settling the Kosovo crisis within the framework of the United Nations, and also within the context of Western demands, as prescribed by the G8 plan. That does not, however, mean that Yugoslavia is capitulating on key issues, such as the composition of a peace implementation force for Kosovo, which the Yugoslav authorities still say should not comprise any of the countries now currently engaged in the aerial campaign against Yugoslavia.
Troops continue to present a picture of formidable power along the borders of Kosovo, capable and ready to overwhelm the Serb forces. A further 100 US combat aircraft are being deployed in the region, with Hungary and Turkey offering base facilities. The French are sending 25 more aircraft, and the British are moving 12 Tornadoes to Corsica from Germany.
Inside Kosovo, the KLA send back optimistic reports of their struggle against the Serbian army. They're outgunned and outmanned and control.
By this time, NATO planes had flown nearly 20,000 bombing missions. In the early hours of May the 15th, NATO bombed the village of Koricha. At least 100 civilians died. NATO said its target was a military camp and that the civilians had been put there as a human shield. The incident underlined the dangers of trying to fight a war from the air alone. And it proved, if proof were needed, that wars cannot be fought without making mistakes. The US announced that yet more planes would be deployed in the region, but public faith in high-tech American weapons was shaken by a series of accidents. The vaunted Apache combat helicopters, 2 of which had crashed in Albania, didn't engage in combat operations. And all the time, the calls for ground troops grew louder.
NATO insists it is not acting as the Air Force for the Kosovo Liberation Army. However, as Allied airstrikes increasingly take out Serb tanks and troops, ethnic Albanian rebels are literally gaining ground.
The Yugoslavs thought that they could wipe out the Kosovo Liberation Army in 5 to 7 days. They have not succeeded in doing that.
NATO says in 2 days of fighting earlier this week, rebel forces took control of the town of Jablanica in western Kosovo, capturing Serb military vehicles, mortars, and ammunition. Question is, can they hold it?
One of the determinations will be whether the Yugoslav forces are have been so pummeled that they don't feel that they can mass and come back against these towns.
The Pentagon says any attempt by Serb forces to retake the town would make the Yugoslav troops easy targets for NATO planes.
If they concentrate, we'll hit them in concentrations rather than smaller groups.
And U.S. officials insist any boost NATO's air campaign is giving to the rebels is an unintended but not unwelcome
a deal that would allow him to keep some troops in Kosovo. Under the conditions set out by Allied diplomats, once Milosevic agrees to NATO's terms and begins withdrawing his forces from Kosovo, NATO would order a bombing pause and let the Serbs complete the pullout, which would take about 7 days. The bombing would resume if Serb troops continued killing on their way out or stopped the withdrawal. Once all Serb forces are out of Kosovo and a NATO peacekeeping force has moved in, a small number of Serb troops would be allowed back in to man border posts, guard holy sites, and clear landmines. That would be a concession to Milosevic, but it would also relieve NATO from having to perform those duties.
This morning, and all 3 clips are tiled imagery, and they depict Harrier attacks against 2 bridges and an army barracks. First slide, please. On this map, you can, well, let's move straight to the actual imagery itself. You can see that that's the location of the attack in southeast Serbia, and this is a highway bridge across a river. Imagery, please. You can clearly see in the center of the screen where the bridge crosses the river. The road, which is on a raised embankment, curves from top left of your screen to the right of the screen. The river comes from top right down to bottom left. You can see the dark line of the water meandering, and also the tall trees that line either side of the target. As the footage unfreezes, the tiled pod continues to track the target as it passes overhead. And there's the impact, a good direct hit. Next slide, please. This slide shows the location of a Serbian army barracks, which was attacked in southern Serbia. Clip, please. Directly in the middle of the screen, you can see the large building, which is the main target, and that's a part of the overall barracks area, which is centered in your screen here. Good definition again, and as the film unfreezes, again, the tired pod rotates. The pilot is nicely lined up on the target, clearly defined, and you can see there a nice direct hit. Final slide, please. This map shows the location of a motorway bridge, again over a river, in southeast Serbia. Last clip, please. In the center of your screen, frozen, this is a shot from an accompanying Harrier. You can see the river coming from the right of your screen, meandering down to the bottom left, and the road splits into two bridges across the river. As we unfreeze, this is the imagery from the attacking aircraft. You could clearly see in the center the bridge, which is the target. And to the top of the screen, of interest, you can see where the other carriageway, the bridge has already been destroyed. Again, the imagery rotates as the tile pod continues to track, nicely on target, on the left bank of the river. And we cut back to a final shot from the accompanying Harrier to give you another perspective of the direct hit. That concludes.
Serbs watching them for these French troops is a routine that cannot be taken lightly.
And we observe all the day and all the night all the movement of the vehicle, the movement of the person.
Serb troops are just 3 kilometers away near the next village and also on top of that hill. Tension has been on the increase as NATO planes hit more targets up and down Yugoslavia, as well as troop concentrations just across the border.
Do not be there when...
NATO planes have also been dropping leaflets in this area, warning Serb soldiers of the consequences of their actions.
Do you think that Milosevic will protect you? Think about it. You'll be personally responsible.
But much of the tension has come from south of the border in Macedonia. The French troops here are in the unenviable position of having to watch their back too. A few weeks ago, they came under attack from a group of assailants firing anti-tank weapons at them. A French patrol car narrowly escaped the attack, which, according to Macedonian authorities, was carried out by a group of 6 Serb Macedonians and 4 Serbs from across the border. The incident was one of 4 in the past 2 months. 2 French soldiers were slightly injured in April when they were attacked by a mob who set their vehicle on fire. Some Serb Macedonians are critical of NATO's campaign against Yugoslavia, but most Albanian Macedonians are pleased with NATO. He says
From an observation post high in the Macedonian hills, NATO troops peer deep into enemy territory. Only a kilometre or so away is the border with Serbia. In turn, a similar Serb post on an opposite hillside keeps an eye on the NATO position, which is manned